1920, in Hoba, in the north of Namibia, a hunter came across an unusual stone. Unusual not because of its size, but because it had a metallic look about it. Later, when scientists analyzed it, they found it contained 82% iron, 16% nickel, and traces of cobalt and chromium. It was a stone from another planet. The largest meteorite ever to be found on Earth. Its shape is strange for an asteroid, and the theory is that it broke up when it hit the ground. The collision happened about 80,000 years ago. It was a very violent crash, but not so violent as to affect the rock finger 300 kilometers away. A calcareous finger of rock that towers over the arid wastes of Damaraland. The rock finger, also called vingerklip or kalkkegel, is 115 feet high. A long time ago, the whole region around it was on the same level as the top of the finger. It's a vestige of an old limestone plateau that formed 150 million years ago and has eroded away, except in a few places where the stone has stood up to the passing of time. Now it's the rock finger's turn to be eroded. Erosion has already attacked the base of the rock, and sooner or later it's bound to collapse. The Earth has been through its great periods of convulsion, and now the age of erosion has set in. On the whole African continent, it's without a doubt in the south of Namibia that the finest example of what large-scale erosion can do is to be found. Here, erosion has carved out one of the most spectacular marvels of nature to be found anywhere in Africa, Fish River Canyon. After the Grand Canyon in Colorado, it's the largest canyon in the world. It's 100 miles long, 15 miles wide, and 1,600 feet deep on average. These giant walls reveal layer upon layer of all sorts of rock. Sandstone, shale, granite, limestone. The canyon is lost in a remote corner of the world, but it has been known to man ever since time immemorial. According to the Sans, a primitive desert people, the canyon was dug by a giant snake called Kultegakuru to conceal its sinuous bulk from the hunters who were chasing it. In actual fact, it was the Fish River that carved out the gorge, at least in part. For this is a complex geological structure. There are actually two canyons, one on top of the other, and they were formed in very different ways. About 500 million years ago, the region underwent a period of intense tectonic activity, and a large crack appeared in the Earth's crust. That produced the Upper Canyon, the bottom of which is made up of the first level of terraces. Later, Fish River started to flow through the newly formed gorge and dug the lower canyon. Nowadays, Fish River almost runs dry in the southern summer, but there's always just enough water for the few baboons that live at the bottom of the gorge to survive. When the winter comes round, the apes often see a few hikers go passing by. The canyon is a sight known to hikers the world over. Before venturing down into the canyon, you have to wait for the right conditions. Avoid extreme temperatures and times when the river may flood. When the river eventually goes on its way, it flows into the Orange, which in turn flows into the Atlantic. Not all the rivers survive the pitfalls of this hostile land. The Tsao Shab rises 250 miles to the north, very near the source of the Fish River. 20 million years ago, on its way to the sea, it carved out this little canyon. The first European pioneers called it the Sesriem Canyon, because Sesriem means 6 rains, and it took 6 rains from an ox cart, tied end to end, to draw water from the bed of the gorge. Today, the canyon is clogged with sand. The first time it got blocked, the river dug a new bed inside the first. Now it has given up altogether. The Tsao Shab no longer reaches the Atlantic. A gigantic barrier has risen up across its path. The highest dunes in the world. The Sesriem Dunes. They form a towering wall 650 feet high. These mountains of sand are actually a lot higher if you measure them from their base, which is well below ground level. The Sesriem Dunes tower over the site of an old dried-out lake, where a lake still forms very occasionally in a particularly rainy season. But more often than not, one drought follows another, and even the acacia trees, robust as they are, have to throw in the towel. This brick red color comes from the high iron oxide content of the sand. The Sesriem Dunes take a variety of shapes and forms. There's no architectural norm, just the most amazing fantasy in the pattern of their bulges and crests. This fanciful design is the work of a capricious sculptor, the wind. From one month to another, it blows in different directions, and because it's constantly starting its work again from another angle, it carves out some extremely complex shapes. When the wind always blows in the same direction, dunes can advance at a rate of about 100 yards a year. But here, as it's always blowing in different directions, they hardly move at all. Before they can go very far in any one direction, the wind blows them back again. So these parabolic dunes are fairly stable, and a little vegetation grows around their base. Enough to feed a few animals, large and small, but all inured to these difficult conditions and not too demanding. These great red dunes are in fact only a very small part of the sea of sand. 12,000 square miles, 200 miles long and up to 100 miles wide. It's the most spectacular part of the Namib Desert. The sand arrived here 3 million years ago. It's thought to come from another desert, the Kalahari, and to have settled here after a long and roundabout journey. First, it was probably carried by the Orange River to the Atlantic. Then sea currents carried it up the coast, eventually dumping it on the shore further north. And from there, the west wind gradually spread it inland. The nearer you get to the Atlantic, the whiter the sand becomes, until you reach the Skeleton Coast, where it's almost pure white. The Skeleton Coast, which backs onto hundreds of miles of desert, must be one of the most inhospitable coastlines in the world. For the first Portuguese explorers and later for the whalers and seal hunters, it was fraught with danger. If they ran aground in these shallow waters, it was certain death, stuck between the ocean and the desert. The sea is cold, about 12 degrees centigrade. For 10 million years, this stretch of the Atlantic has been cooled by the Benguela current, which brings water from the depths of the ocean up to the surface. This cold current brings fish galore close enough to the shore to provide a slap-up feast for the seals. These are Cape fur seals. Their thick fur traps the air, keeping their body temperature at a steady 37 degrees centigrade, even when they swim for hours in the cold water. Most of the time, the males weigh around 450 pounds, but in the mating season, they fatten themselves up to fight over the females, and then their weight can double to around 800 pounds. Each male has a harem of about 25 females. Females are much smaller. They weigh around 160 pounds. After 9 months gestation, they each give birth to one pup. They're all born almost at the same time, in the space of a month, generally in late November or early December. Less than an hour after being born, the pups start sucking their mother's milk. The first weeks are highly dangerous for seal pups. A quarter of them are killed by the hyenas and jackals that prowl the shoreline. It's a time when the mothers have to take great care of their young. Then, when the pups have grown a little stronger, the mothers leave them in a sort of group nursery and go off fishing again. A mother never mistakes her young for another. She knows it by its scent and its call. At the age of 4 or 5 months, the pups molt and change colour, gradually shedding their dark grey fur for a fine brown coat. They stay with their mothers until they're about 1 year old. Then they can start playing and joining in with the adults. There are large numbers of seal colonies all along this South African coastline. Their total population is well up in the hundreds of thousands. Every year they eat 1 million tons of fish and squid, which is more than the fishermen catch in Namibia and South Africa together. The fishermen resent this competition and have persuaded the authorities to cull the seal population. The Cape Cross colony is right in the line of fire. It alone often numbers more than 200,000 seals. Every year the surplus seals are killed off. Where the masses of cold air from the sea meet up on the shoreline with the dry heat of the desert, a mist forms every evening and spreads inland. Before the mist disappears in the morning sun, the plants and animals drink and soak up every drop of water. That's the secret of their survival in a land with zero rainfall. In the Nama language, Namib means Great Arid Plain, but the water is there after a fashion, silent and invisible. More than 1/3 of the African continent is desert. On the edges of these arid regions, water flows like a gift from the gods. In Morocco, in the Middle Atlas Mountains, several small streams flow down the mountainside and link up to form the Ouzoud. Here, the Ouzoud drops 350 feet. The rock face it runs down is limestone. The water erodes it in two ways. It wears it down mechanically, but it also erodes it by a chemical process. The carbon dioxide in the water dissolves the limestone rock. Flow of water varies considerably with the season, but it's always spectacular, for the Ouzoud never runs dry. In these regions, the watercourses are capricious and unreliable. They're called wadis. One of them feeds this little waterfall on the border of Algeria and Tunisia in the region of Tamerza. The wadi can occasionally turn into a raging torrent for a few hours, but most of the time it's a peaceful stream. In these arid mountains, the water directly attacks the rock as there's no vegetation to protect it, and the erosion is spectacular. A wadi dug this gorge at Mides. The bed of this river has since dried up completely. It dates back to another era when the climate was wetter and the water flowed fast and furious. Today, the climate is growing warmer and drier, and mankind unwittingly makes matters worse by diverting water from its course to irrigate his land. In Ethiopia, turning the Awash Valley into farmland has taken up so much water that the river downstream has dried almost to a trickle where it runs into Lake Abbe. "8,500 years ago, Lake Abbe covered an area of 2,300 square miles. Today it has shrunk to 1/40th of its former size. The water is fast evaporating, and the Awash no longer replaces it fast enough. The lake should disappear completely within a decade or two." As it dries up, the lake reveals some very surprising scenery. It's probably unique in the world, a series of giant columns that seem to have simply been deposited on the expanses of land deserted by its waters. These are the same great chimneys that are found on the ocean bed. As it disappears, the lake is leaving us with an open-air exhibition of what goes on deep on the ocean floor. These great chimneys are composed of travertine, a highly porous form of limestone. At first glance, they may seem to be scattered randomly around the bed of the lake. In actual fact, most of them are aligned, placed along underground fractures in the Earth's crust. Lake Abbe is located in an area where the Earth is unstable, mobile, and still highly active, as you can tell by the large number of hot geysers. If the waters of Lake Abbe had not dried up, another chimney would be in formation at this very spot. All these chimneys were built by these hot springs alone. The water here is very rich in calcium. When it used to bubble up, boiling hot, through the cracks and come into contact with the cold water in the lake, the calcium was suddenly not so soluble and settled out as limestone. These reliefs in Lake Abbe are outcrops, accumulations of matter thrown up from the bowels of the earth which have not yet been eroded away. Most of nature's sculptures are formed in the opposite way, by subtraction, by wearing down, by removing matter from existing rock masses. It's only a question of time. All rocks, whatever they're made of, are subject to erosion by wind, water, heat, and cold, with more or less spectacular effects. This pink granite massif is in Morocco at Tafraout in the Atlas Mountains. These rocks were formed in the bowels of the earth under the effects of tremendous pressure and high temperatures. Then they were thrust up to the surface. As granite is a hard rock, it did not fold or bend, it broke. It snapped into 1,000 pieces that remained more or less stuck together. These natural sculptures are exhibited here over an area the size of a village. In the south of the continent, there's a place where you can admire them by the hundreds, for miles and miles around. That place is the Matobos Hills, an extraordinary site near Bulawayo in southwest Zimbabwe. These landscapes, dotted with rocky outcrops, bear witness to a bygone era, the days when the African continent took shape in the throes of tectonic convulsions tens of millions of years ago. The whole region underwent a violent upheaval, erupting in a hail of rock, thrown up from the depths of the earth with such force that it lifted the earth's crust to form domes and peaks. Once the great upheaval was over, erosion set in, wearing down the softer rock and gradually reducing the volume of the mountains. All these rocks are made of the same granite, an agglomeration of crystals of quartz, feldspar, mica, iron. At the bottom of the hills they're all grey and look older than their high-altitude cousins. In fact, the rocks higher up are the same age, but less sheltered and therefore more exposed to erosion. They don't have time to get covered with moss and grow dull. All these patterns were sculpted on the spot by erosion cutting through the rocks and separating them. Granite may be impermeable and theoretically not very prone to erosion, but it tends to split under the effect of hot and cold temperatures. The often geometric shape of the fractures corresponds to lines of weakness in the rock's structure. The vegetation also plays a part in the process. The trees dig their roots into the cracks full of humus, imperceptibly increasing the pressure on the stone. The most figurative compositions are made of mounds of ball-shaped stones. The stone balls are formed in one of two ways. Some start out as cubes of stone and their corners are gradually eroded away. Some are pre-formed cores of solid granite that remain once the coating of softer rock around them has gradually worn away. The opposite effect also exists. When nature works the other way round, carving out hollows instead of volumes, like we see here where the rock is grooved and carved on much of its surface. This time the markings are the work of water. They date from the days when the level of the Blyde River was much higher. The Blyde River lies in the Drakensberg region of Transvaal in South Africa, a small, unimposing river that would never have known fame if it hadn't carved out some veritable masterpieces of erosion along its course. When the waters of the river go surging through this rocky corridor, they spend their energy attacking the rock. The Blyde dug out these round holes in its bed that are known as giant's cauldrons. Round holes like these are quite common, but there are not many places in the world where there are so many, so close together that they leave the stone looking like fine lacework. These are known as the Burke's Luck potholes. This amazing tangle of rocky bridges and potholes tells us a little about the river's history, its different water levels, and its unswerving determination to follow its course. Leaving the potholes behind it, the river plunges into a narrow gorge and continues on its way. But its work on the rock has not finished yet. It must now force its way through the hard rock formations of the Drakensberg Mountains. The river traces its path through the middle of one of the finest settings in South Africa, the Blyde River Canyon. The canyon is about 20 miles long and up to 2,500 feet deep. It's overlooked by 3 summits shaped like columns with hats on. They're called the 3 rondavels because they're reminiscent of the round huts of the same name, traditional in South Africa. The site is protected. A 64,000-acre natural reserve straddles the banks of the river. In less than 12 miles, the waters of the Blyde River have dropped more than 3,000 feet in altitude. At the end of its course, the river flows into the Indian Ocean. This water is working on another substance. It has a different aim in mind, to go crashing blindly through the basalt and on into the Atlantic Ocean. It's the River Cam in Cameroon on the other side of the continent. The Cam has its source in an old chain of volcanoes in the west of the country. Suddenly the river slows down. There's a moment's respite, as if it were preparing for the great leap it's about to make. Then the water plunges 260 feet in one fell swoop. The falls are not named after the river. They're called the Ekon Falls. It's an extraordinary place. The mass of water comes thundering down amid lush vegetation. The falls are just one of many hitches along the river's course. No sooner has it passed them than it has to fight its way through the thick forest. In this part of Cameroon, the rivers are all alike in terms of their vigour, their force, and the extraordinary way they contend with any obstacles in their path. The Goom here is about to plunge 130 feet. Here again, the falls have a different name from the river. Everybody here calls them the Mwaka Falls. Of all the rivers of Cameroon, this is the one that holds the biggest surprise in store. It crosses the southwest of the country, a small river called the Lobe. The Lobe is a fairly ordinary river, except when it reaches the sea. At Kribi, the Lobe too gushes over a rocky ledge. The Lobe Falls are beautiful but modest in every way. They're only about 40 feet high. It's not their height, nor their width, nor the volume of water they carry that makes these falls exceptional. It's simply the fact that at the foot of the falls lies the sea. It's one of the only places in the world where a river throws itself directly into the ocean in this way. At Kribi, the transition from fresh water to seawater is abrupt. The falls are too high for the seawater to reach inland even at high tide. Here in Senegal, two rivers, the Sine and the Saloum, reach the sea at a spot where the land is almost flat, and they form a huge delta. The sea races inland with the tide, cutting off hundreds of islands. Some of them are covered in seashells. Nobody in the Saloum Delta knows precisely where the river stops and the ocean begins. The delta is crossed by a few large watercourses, but mainly by a multitude of small channels, the bolons. In this labyrinth of saltwater channels, the only tree capable of thriving on these tidal shores is the mangrove. Every year, the mangrove sheds its leaves. That makes about 5 tons of leaves per acre. All this foliage sinks to the bed of the estuary and eventually makes new land. These mangrove swamps are quite a unique biotope. They cover about 800 square miles of the Saloum estuary with a strange universe teeming with life. Nonchalantly and mysteriously, the waters of the Sine and Saloum rivers blend sooner or later with the sea. That's the fate of all rivers, to lose themselves in the ocean. All rivers bar one, that is, the Okavango. The Okavango rises in Angola, in an extremely wet region. With plenty of water running into it, it's a majestic, seemingly uneventful river, at least for the first 800 miles of its course. When it reaches Botswana, the river hesitates, as if wondering which way to go next. Then it opens out into the northwest of the country like an outstretched hand. The river Okavango, as it's known here, spreads out into a myriad of streams and channels, covering an area of about 6,000 square miles. It's one of the largest inland deltas in the world, and the only one whose waters never reach the sea. Little by little, they're eventually absorbed by the thirsty land of the Kalahari Desert. The Okavango Delta provides an exceptional environment that sustains and protects a remarkable variety of wildlife. The only way to appreciate it fully is to take a ride in what they call a mokoro, one of these canoes dug out of a sausage tree or an ebony. The current in some of the streams is very fast flowing, but there are calmer waters they call madibas. The delta has an amazingly complex hydrography, which is forever changing. Every year, the river deposits nearly 1 million tons of alluvium, which inevitably blocks some of the channels. On the other hand, the hippopotami sometimes open up new passages by crushing the vegetation. Occasionally, something more radical happens. Every year, 2 or 3 earth tremors are recorded here. One of them, in 1952, brought water back to the River Boro, which had been dry for over 30 years. It was in the wake of just such an earthquake that the Okavango spread out like this millions of years ago. Even today, a strongish earthquake would completely change the face of the delta. Unless man does it first. Some people are talking about diverting the water to irrigate the land. The fate of the delta is much the same as that of all the landscapes on the African continent. They were created by the forces of nature. They're changing daily under the effects of the elements, and they're permanently threatened by the designs of men.